In a courtroom filled with tension, 12-year-old Nate Cruz faces a sentence that will change his life forever. Convicted of a crime he didn't commit, Nate's silence is misinterpreted as guilt, but the truth is far darker than anyone imagined. As the investigation unfolds, shocking secrets about his family come to light, and Nate's quiet struggle becomes the key to unraveling a twisted tale of betrayal. But when Nate finally speaks, the truth leaves everyone in disbelief. What really happened the night his sister Emma died? And how far will Nate go to protect those he loves? Watch as this heartbreaking story of justice, family, and healing reveals the incredible power of truth. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. The courthouse was quiet, the air heavy with tension. Nathaniel Nate Cruz, only 12 years old, stood before the judge, his small hands trembling slightly from the cold metal cuffs that bound his wrists. His worn-out sneakers barely made a sound as he shuffled slowly through the hallway, flanked by 2 officers. The weight of the moment seemed to press down on him, but his face remained unreadable, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. He could barely hear the murmurs of the people around him, his mind drowning out everything except the pounding of his heart. "Keep up, kid," one of the officers muttered in a voice that tried to sound professional but failed to hide the pity. Nate didn't respond, but the words stung in a way he couldn't explain. How could he explain this? The act that had brought him here, the tragic night that had shattered his family and his life in an instant. Nate's mind wandered back to that night, to the baby crib, to the soft cries of his sister Emma, and the weight of the pillow in his hand. His throat tightened, but the emotions inside him were locked away, buried deep under layers of silence he hadn't been able to break. How could he tell them the truth? That it wasn't what they thought. That it was never meant to be like this. As they reached the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors loomed before him, and Nate felt a shiver run down his spine. His defense attorney, Ava Pierce, was waiting outside. She was a kind woman, someone who believed in Nate's innocence, but even she couldn't shield him from the consequences that were now inevitable. She bent down to his level, her voice gentle. "Nate, stay calm, all right? You're going to be all right," she whispered. But Nate could only nod, his lips pressed tightly together. He didn't know if he believed her. How could he? His entire world had crumbled in the space of a few days. Inside the courtroom, the mood was somber. The people stood as the judge, Matthew Collins, entered the room, his gaze sharp and calculating. At 60, Judge Collins had seen many cases in his career, but this one was different. It wasn't just the severity of the crime, but the age of the defendant. He had never had to pass sentence on a child so young before. "Please be seated," the judge said, his voice steady and firm as he adjusted his glasses. The room settled into a hushed silence, the only sounds the rustling of papers as the judge prepared to read his verdict. Nate, still standing at the front, felt like every eye in the room was focused solely on him. His mother, Laura, sat in the front row, her face pale and gaunt from the strain of the past few weeks. Her hand gripped Raphael's tightly, her husband, whose face showed the same exhaustion and disbelief. The couple had once been full of life, but now they were shadows of themselves, worn down by grief and the trial that had torn their world apart. The prosecutor, Julian Ross, stood up. His voice was cold, clinical. "Your Honor, we are here today for the sentencing of Nathaniel Cruz, who stands convicted of first-degree homicide in the death of his 3-month-old sister, Emma Cruz." The words were like a punch to the gut, and Nate's heart clenched. He knew what was coming next, but hearing it out loud still felt like an unbearable weight. The evidence was damning. Nate's fingerprints had been found on the pillow used to smother Emma, and a neighbor had testified that she had seen Nate leave the room shortly before Emma was found dead. The psychological reports indicated a pattern of troubling behavior, though Nate had remained silent throughout the trial, unwilling to defend himself, unable to. His silence had been misinterpreted as guilt, but how could he explain what he didn't understand himself? Nate's mind flashed back to those early days, to the moments when he'd been excited to become a big brother. He had been so protective of Emma, even when she was just a tiny newborn, her cries waking him up in the middle of the night. But everything had changed in the days leading up to that night, and Nate had felt something shift inside him. A feeling of fear he couldn't shake, a feeling that had only grown stronger when his Uncle Jack had moved in with them. The judge, after hearing the prosecutor's summary, turned his gaze toward Nate. "Nathaniel Cruz, this court finds you guilty of first-degree homicide," Judge Collins said, his voice firm, but Nate could see the flicker of compassion in his eyes. "Given your age and the nature of the crime, you are sentenced to 9 years. In a juvenile detention center." The words hit Nate like a physical blow. 9 years. His heart pounded in his chest as the gavel came down, the sharp sound echoing in the courtroom. His mother gasped, a soft, heartbreaking sound, and her sobs echoed through the room. Raphael's face twisted in pain, his body stiff with disbelief. Nate felt his world shatter in that moment. 9 years of his life, taken away for something that had been nothing more than an accident. But the words had been said. The sentence was handed down. And it felt like the truth had died with them. Ava Pierce, his defense attorney, leaned over to Nate, trying to offer a comforting smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's not over, Nate. We can still fight this. We'll appeal, we'll find a way," she whispered. But Nate didn't believe her. It felt like the end. The courtroom began to empty, the murmurs growing louder as reporters started preparing their notes. Nate remained motionless, unable to process everything that had just happened. His world had become a blur of noise and confusion. As the officers moved to escort him out of the room, he glanced at his mother one last time, her face a mixture of heartbreak and hopelessness. He wanted to speak, to tell her everything, but the words wouldn't come. He was just a child who had seen too much, heard too much, and carried too much in silence. As the doors to the courtroom closed behind him, the silence of the hallway swallowed him whole. The weeks following the trial were a blur for the Cruz family. Nate's life had been reduced to a series of routines that felt meaningless. Days passed, and the weight of his sentence hung over him like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. His world had been torn apart and nothing felt the same. The juvenile detention center was cold, sterile, and full of harsh rules, yet it was also a place of silence, just like the one he had lived in for so long. Nate couldn't escape the memories of that night. He kept replaying the same scene in his mind. The crib, the pillow, the cries of his sister, and the feeling of terror that gripped his chest. But there was one thing that kept nagging at him, a truth buried deep in his heart that he couldn't quite bring himself to confront. He couldn't shake the fear that he had missed something important. And as the days turned into weeks, Nate realized that the silence he had kept was not just his own. There was something much darker lurking in the shadows. Something he hadn't understood until now. Back at home, Laura and Raphael were left to pick up the pieces of their broken family. Laura had never been the same after the trial. The loss of Emma, combined with the guilt of what had happened to Nate, weighed heavily on her. She tried to focus on the small tasks, cooking dinner, cleaning the house, getting through each day. But inside she felt empty. Raphael, too, was distant. He blamed himself for not seeing the signs, for not understanding what was happening to his son. It wasn't until a few weeks after the trial that things began to change. One afternoon, Detective Rachel Moore, who had been quietly following up on the case, came to speak with Laura and Raphael. Rachel was a seasoned investigator with a sharp mind and a keen sense of intuition. She had been with the police force for nearly 15 years, and she had a gut feeling that there was more to this case than what the court had determined. "Mrs. Cruz, Mr. Cruz," Rachel began as she sat down at their kitchen table. "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions. I've been reviewing the case, and there's something that doesn't sit right with me." She paused, watching them closely. "I think Nate was protecting someone, Laura." And Raphael exchanged a confused look. "Protecting someone? What do you mean?" Raphael asked, his voice cautious. Rachel took a deep breath. "I've been speaking to the people who knew Nate the best, his teachers, his friends, his neighbors, And what I'm hearing is that there's a pattern of behavior that wasn't properly addressed. Nate's actions, his silence, they didn't make sense under the circumstances. Laura's eyes widened. You think Nate didn't do it? She whispered, barely believing her own words. I'm not saying he didn't play a role, but I don't think he did it intentionally. Nate is a good kid, and I think he was forced into a situation where he didn't know how to act. He was scared, confused, and, I believe, manipulated. Rachel explained. The words hung in the air, and for the first time in weeks, Laura and Raphael felt a spark of hope. But it was fragile. But why would Nate protect someone if he didn't understand what happened? Laura asked, her voice shaking with emotion. Rachel leaned forward. That's what I need to figure out, and I need your help. I want to re-examine the people who were closest to him in the weeks leading up to Emma's death. I need to talk to his teacher, Lydia Thomas, again, and I need to speak with his uncle, Jack Foster. The mention of Jack's name made Laura's heart race. She hadn't trusted him ever since he had moved in with the family. He had been a constant presence in their home after Emma's birth, but there had always been something about him that made Laura uncomfortable. He was too familiar with everything, too eager to be involved in their lives, and yet, whenever Nate had looked at him, there had always been a shadow of fear in his eyes. You want to talk to Jack? Raphael asked, his voice tight with suspicion. But why? He's family. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. That's exactly why. I believe Jack might know more than he's letting on. We need to see if he had any involvement in what happened. A few days later, Detective Moore met with Lydia Thomas, Nate's teacher, at a small cafe near the school. Lydia had been devastated by the trial's outcome. She had always seen Nate as a bright, well-behaved child, and she couldn't understand how he could have committed such an act. But now, listening to Rachel's concerns, she began to wonder if she had missed something in her earlier assessments. I remember the day Nate started acting different, Lydia said quietly, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her coffee cup. It was just before Emma's death. He was so quiet, so withdrawn. And then, one day during recess, he just broke down. He was sitting alone on the steps, crying as if he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. When I tried to approach him, he wouldn't say anything. It was like he was afraid to speak. Rachel listened carefully, taking notes. Did you notice anything else, any signs that Nate was in danger? Lydia hesitated, her eyes clouding with guilt. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I thought it was just the stress of being a new big brother. But now that I think about it, I should have paid more attention. Rachel nodded. We're going to need to look deeper into what was happening at home. If there's someone Nate was trying to protect, we need to find out who. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Rachel finally confronted Jack Foster. Jack had been living with the Cruz family for several months, helping out with the newborn, but something in his demeanor had always been off. He was calm, almost too calm, especially when talking about Emma's death. Rachel had a suspicion that Jack wasn't as innocent as he appeared, and she was determined to find the truth. I don't know what you're implying, Jack said when Rachel questioned him. His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. I've always been there for Nate and his family. I love that little girl as much as anyone. Rachel wasn't convinced. We've heard some troubling things, Jack. We know about your behavior before Emma's death, and we need you to be honest with us. Did you have any involvement in what happened that night? Jack's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he took a step back. I don't have to answer to you, I'm family. Rachel's gaze didn't waver. Not anymore, you're not. I'll be back with more questions. As Rachel left the room, she knew that the pieces were starting to fit together, but she still didn't have enough to make a solid case. Nate's silence was no longer just a sign of guilt. It was a shield protecting him from a much darker reality. The truth was beginning to emerge, but it was tangled in a web of fear, manipulation, and lies. And as the investigation deepened, so did the questions. Could Jack really be behind the tragedy that had shattered the Cruz family? And if so, why had Nate remained silent for so long? The answers were still out of reach, but one thing was certain. This case was far from over. Days turned into weeks. But for Laura and Raphael, time seemed to stand still. The world around them felt frozen in a state of disbelief, and the pain of losing Emma was still a constant ache in their hearts. But there was something else now, a growing uncertainty about what had really happened on that fateful night. The trial had given them no closure, only a sentence that seemed unjust, a child's life shattered under the weight of an event no one fully understood. Nate, confined to the juvenile detention center, spent his days in silence. His meals were eaten alone, his cell quiet except for the occasional shuffle of footsteps down the hall. He had learned to keep to himself, to avoid the questions and the curious stares of the other kids. But deep inside, the burden of the truth gnawed at him, a secret that he could no longer carry alone. He hadn't spoken to anyone about that night, about the dark figure in the doorway, about the whispers that had terrified him. He had kept quiet because in his heart, he still believed that silence was the only way to protect the ones he loved. But as the days passed, Nate began to change. It was subtle at first. He started drawing more, the once blank pages now filled with chaotic lines and dark shadows. His counselor, Eleanor Matthews, noticed it right away. She had been working with Nate for a few weeks, trying to coax him into opening up, but so far he had been silent, nervous, withdrawn, and seemingly uncooperative. However, the drawings were different. There was something in them, something that made Eleanor pause as she flipped through the pages. "Nate," Eleanor asked gently one afternoon, "can you tell me what these drawings mean?" Nate sat across from her, his hands gripping the pencil so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His eyes flicked to the drawings, but he didn't say anything. Eleanor noticed how his body tensed, his gaze shifting nervously between the drawings and her. "It's okay," Eleanor continued, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but sometimes drawing can help us understand what we're feeling. Can you try to tell me what's in your head?" Nate didn't respond right away. His pencil moved across the paper again, but this time it was slower, as if he was working up the courage to say something. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I was trying to protect her," he said, his voice trembling. I saw him that night." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Who did you see, Nate?" Nate hesitated, his eyes darting to the corner of the room, as if afraid someone might be listening. "My uncle. Jack," he whispered. "He was the one who hurt her." The room fell silent as Eleanor processed what Nate had just said. The weight of his words hung in the air, a sudden revelation that sent shockwaves through her mind. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. It was the truth that no one had known, the truth that Nate had been holding inside for so long. "Nate," Eleanor said softly, her voice full of compassion, "you did the right thing by telling me. We need to make sure that people know what happened, that you're not alone in this." But Nate wasn't convinced. "They won't believe me," he said, his eyes full of doubt. "They'll think I'm lying. They'll think I'm guilty." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes steady. "Nate, I believe you, and I'm going to make sure that we get to the truth. You're not guilty of anything. This is not your fault." Nate sat back, his shoulders slumped with the weight of the truth he had just shared. But despite the relief of finally speaking, he still felt trapped in the silence that had consumed him for so long. The burden of guilt, even though misplaced, still clung to him. How could he have stayed quiet for so long? Why had he never said anything before? Back at home, Laura and Raphael received the unexpected news from Detective Rachel Moore. It had been weeks since their last conversation, but now Rachel was back, and she had something to say that shook the very foundation of everything they thought they knew. "I've spoken to Nate," Rachel said, her voice tight with urgency, "and he's finally told us the truth. It wasn't him. It was Jack." The words hit Laura and Raphael like a thunderbolt. For weeks, they had mourned their son's guilt, convinced that Nate had been responsible for Emma's death. But now, hearing that Jack was involved, everything changed. The shock was immediate. the realization too much to process in one go. "Are you sure?" Raphael asked, his voice strained with disbelief. "Are you telling me that Nate didn't do it?" Rachel nodded, her face grim. "Nate didn't commit the crime. He's been silent for so long because he was trying to protect his sister and his mother. Jack was the one who hurt Emma." Laura's hands shook as she clutched the edge of the table. But why didn't he say something sooner? Why did he stay quiet? Rachel's gaze softened. He was scared. He was just a child, and Jack manipulated him, made him believe that speaking out would make things worse. But Nate has finally broken his silence. And now, we need to take action. That night, the Cruz family gathered together, a rare moment of unity amidst the storm of emotions. The truth had finally come to light, but the path ahead was still uncertain. Laura sat with Raphael holding his hand, trying to process everything she had just learned. "We have to do something," Laura said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "We can't let Jack get away with this, not after everything he's done to our family." Raphael nodded, his eyes burning with the intensity of his feelings. "We won't. We'll fight for Nate. We'll fight for Emma. We have to make sure that Jack is held accountable." As they sat together, a quiet resolve began to form within them. The truth had been buried, but now it was rising to the surface, like a flood of light breaking through the darkness. And with the help of Detective Moore, they would do everything they could to make sure that justice was served. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions for the Cruz family. The weight of the truth, finally uncovered, had brought an overwhelming sense of relief, but it also carried a new kind of burden. The truth was no longer buried beneath silence, but now it had to be faced. And with it came the realization that the journey toward healing would be anything but simple. The investigation into Jack Foster, Nate's uncle, moved quickly after the breakthrough. Detective Rachel Moore, with the help of other officers, began gathering evidence against Jack. The more they dug, the more disturbing the findings became. Jack had been living in the Cruz household for months, a fixture in their lives after the birth of Emma. What appeared to be acts of kindness, helping, Laura with the newborn supporting the family, had been a carefully constructed mask. Beneath it, Jack had been hiding his true nature, and now the truth was coming to light. The police uncovered files on Jack's phone, texts, images, and videos that revealed his disturbing behavior. Evidence began to mount, leading the investigators to believe that Jack had been involved in the deaths of other children in different families. The crimes went far beyond what they had initially suspected. Jack was arrested and charged with multiple counts of abuse, homicide, and exploitation. But despite the progress in the case, Nate's recovery was far from assured. He was still locked in a silent battle with himself, with the guilt he had carried for so long, and with the memories of that night that he hadn't been able to forget. It was one thing to speak the truth, but it was another thing entirely to believe it, to accept that he had been a victim, not a perpetrator. Nate's therapy sessions with Eleanor Matthews continued, but progress was slow. The young boy had begun to open up, but only in small, fragile steps. Each session was a struggle, and his voice barely a whisper. He had admitted the truth to Eleanor, but every time he spoke about the events that led to Emma's death, his face twisted with shame. One afternoon, Eleanor asked Nate to draw again. This time, instead of dark shadows and figures looming over cribs, she encouraged him to draw something else, a scene of peace, something that would help him visualize a future without fear. After a long, heavy pause, Nate's pencil slowly moved across the paper. The image he created was simple, yet it spoke volumes. It was a picture of a tree, its branches reaching out towards a bright sun. At the base of the tree were small figures: Nate, his mother, and his father. They were all standing together, their hands intertwined, smiling in the warmth of the sun. Eleanor looked at the drawing with a soft smile. "That's beautiful, Nate," she said gently, her voice full of encouragement. "Do you think that's what your family could have? A place of peace, a place where you don't have to carry this weight anymore. Nate's eyes flicked to the drawing, and for the first time in weeks, a tiny spark of hope flickered in his eyes. I don't know if we can ever go back to how things were, he said quietly, his voice trembling. But I think maybe we can still heal. Maybe we can still be happy again. Eleanor nodded, her heart swelling with pride. That's all any of us can hope for, Nate. Healing doesn't happen overnight, but every step you take is one closer to peace. And you're not alone in this. Back at home, the Cruz family was slowly beginning to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The house was quieter now. No more hurried footsteps or frantic whispers in the hallways. Emma's room, once filled with laughter and joy, now sat empty, a painful reminder of the life they had lost. But as much as the grief consumed them, Laura and Raphael found themselves clinging to the truth that had come to light. Their son, Nate, had been a victim, just like Emma. He hadn't killed his sister. He had been trying to protect her. One evening after dinner, Laura sat down with Nate on the couch. He was no longer the broken, silent boy who had entered the juvenile detention center weeks ago. He had started to speak, to share his feelings, no longer hiding behind the silence that had defined him for so long. Laura reached over, placing a hand on Nate's shoulder. I'm so proud of you, Nate, she said softly. For everything you've done. For speaking up. For finally telling the truth. Nate glanced at his mother, his expression still weary but now softened with understanding. I'm sorry, Mom, I should have told you sooner. I should have said something before. Laura shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. No, baby. You don't need to apologize. You've carried this burden for far too long. We'll get through this together, okay? You're not alone anymore. Nate nodded, his throat tight with emotion. It had been so long since he'd felt the warmth of his mother's embrace without the crushing weight of guilt hanging over him. Slowly, he let go of the fear that had paralyzed him for so long. Maybe there was hope after all. As the investigation into Jack Foster continued, the Cruz family received a surprising visit from Detective Moore. She had been working tirelessly to build a case against Jack, and now, the pieces were finally falling into place. Jack had been connected to multiple criminal cases across the city, and it seemed that his actions went far beyond what had been initially uncovered. The police were now investigating his ties to a larger network of criminals who exploited vulnerable families, and Jack's arrest was just the beginning of a much bigger investigation. But even with Jack behind bars, Laura knew that there was still work to be done. The wounds left by Jack's betrayal could not be healed overnight, but at least now, the truth had been exposed. And with it, came a new sense of justice. The Cruz family's healing was far from over. It would take time, therapy, and a lot of patience. But one thing was certain, Nate was no longer alone. He had his family, his truth, and a future that was no longer clouded by silence and fear. As Nate sat by the window one evening, looking out at the setting sun, he realized that the journey to healing had only just begun. But with each passing day, he felt stronger, more ready to face the world that had once seemed so dark and full of fear. And for the first time in a long while, Nate believed that maybe, just maybe, he could find peace. The healing process for the Cruz family was slow and full of setbacks, but it was a process that was now rooted in truth. Nate's silence, which had once felt like a barrier between him and the world, was no longer his shield. He had taken the first step towards understanding, towards forgiveness, and towards a future where he no longer had to carry the weight of guilt alone. The family's path to healing would continue to be difficult, but together, they would face it head-on. Justice had been served, and although the scars of the past would remain, the Cruz family now knew that there was hope for a brighter future, a future where the truth could finally be spoken, and where love and healing could finally, take root.